for those of you who were here at last month's meetup, we had as our introductory question, who's used a PWA? And there was a lot of confusion. Either I don't know what it is, or I've kind of heard about it, but I don't think I've ever used one. And so my approach was, you may have and never have realized it, and I thought we might need some quick overview of what it is. As part of this, I was trying to make a custom demo, and I've kind of went a little overboard at what I was trying to do. So these slides are up on the web on GitHub pages. Apparently, anyways, so it's actually, I thought I'd changed it so that it gave the URL, but apparently I didn't post that to GitHub pages, but it's Amelia BR and what hyphen is hyphen a hyphen PWA. I will tweet out a link, or he will tweet out a link. And yeah, they're not actually a PWA yet. I might get that done by the time these videos go online, but we'll see. In the meantime, they're just a single page app slide deck. So what is a PWA? It is a progressive web application, which is a long phrase, so they shortened it to PWA, which isn't actually any shorter when you're saying it aloud, so I'll just call them progressive web apps from here on in. But progressive web application, that's kind of a bunch of meaningless buzzwords. What is it actually? So it's a website. It's a website that has been progressively enhanced, so it acts like an app. So if you're not familiar with the phrase progressively enhanced, it's big in web standard circles and hopefully in other web development circles. The idea that you start with something simple and you work up to fuller function because you have to deal with many different browsers which have many different functionalities. So please don't crash. Okay. Sorry. There's the. So where does the name come from? It comes from a pair of people who were working on it, Alex Russell and Francis Berryman, and a couple years after Francis wrote a blog post sort of, what does this name mean from? And so her summary, PWAs are just a bunch of technologies with a zingy new brand name that keeps the open web going a bit longer. The name isn't for you being the web developers. The name is for your boss. It's for your investor. It's for your marketer. It's for the person who says, we need an app for that. And you can say, I'll make you an app. I'll make you a progressive web app. And you don't tell them that it's just a website that's been progressively enhanced, because you'd rather make one website than make 3 different apps, plus a desktop, who knows what, and plus the website that you're going to have to make anyways. So it's a buzzword. It's intentionally vague and all-inclusive. But really, what is a PWA? Can I not hit the wrong buttons? So it's a progressive website, as in progressively enhanced, plus installation metadata, for want of a better term, extra metadata that you send in that tells a browser operating system combo how to install it like they would install an app. And so by install, meaning things like it shows up on a home screen or a start menu, and you can click on it just like you'd click an app, but other things like icons and whatever, we'll get into the details. Just if you're going to treat this like an app, not just a website, you need a little bit of extra information. And then the other really important thing, the complicated thing, the thing that I never got in time to do for making my demo actually functional, is to add offline support. Because if something's going to act like an app, you expect that when you click that button on your home screen, something actually happens. You don't just get the Chrome offline dinosaur. You get, at the very least, a custom branded offline page that is specific to that app. And that's sort of the minimum expectation depending on what the app is. It might be completely functional offline. So this sort of set of ideas is what people are talking about when they say progressive web app. So start with a well-made website, progressively enhanced website, and then offline support and just a little bit of extra metadata so that the browsers can install it and pretend it is a full-fledged native app. So I've already talked about progressive enhancement, basic functionality in basic browsers, better functionality in better browsers. And so that's part of the name, that's key idea. And it's unfortunately something that tends to get overlooked as companies say, oh, we've got our new PWA, and you go to the link and it says, I'm sorry, this is only available in Chrome. And no, that's not the idea. The idea is you start with a website that works everywhere and then you build up. So if it's not at least basic functionality in any web browser made this decade, then not really a progressive web app. So part of that is also progressive means responsive, as in not just different browsers, but different screen size. It's part of that whole, if you're doing the web properly, modern website, you're working for all devices, not just mobile devices. Okay, so what's a website? Well, we all use websites, but when talking about progressive web apps, it's useful to think, what is a website that is different from a native app? So one word that comes up is it's discoverable. It'll be in your regular Google search results, not just in an app store. Although app stores are starting to list progressive web apps as well, but it's the place where you go when you're just checking out what this company or what this surface is. You're already there. It's not something separate that you have to download. And once you're there, you can get a URL and take that link and email it to somebody or tweet it to somebody, and they can find right where you are without having to go through, download this app and then go through 5 different menus to try and find that feature. And as I mentioned, it's operating system independent, and you don't have to create the same app many times over for many different platforms. Another key thing about modern websites is they should be secure, or at least in the sense of encrypted. HTTPS is required for anything to be a progressive web app, and that's because if you're not serving over HTTPS, the next 2 features won't work at all in browsers. They just don't support new advanced features on unencrypted connections. So those new advanced features. Just quickly, I've already said this, the installation metadata, it's just an extra data file. It's a JSON file. It's called a manifest, specifically a web manifest. And it defines the extra little bits to make it behave like an app. And the offline support comes from something called a Serviceworker, which is just special JavaScript API. So that's where your offline support comes in. It's just more JavaScript coding, which you're clearly all excited about. So, looking a little more detail, what is this web manifest? As I said, it's a JSON file. You link to it from every page with a rel attribute that specifically says manifest. The spec comes up with a .webmanifest file extension, but everybody supports it as just old plain .json. You'll note one thing with my file names there is I've got a language code in them because some of the stuff in the manifest is language specific. So if you're making a multilingual site, you're going to have multiple manifests for each language version. So what your manifest should have at the very least is a start URL, which is what particular page should be opened up when somebody clicks on their home icon. It should have a name, a nice useful name for people to understand, and a short name that can fit on the little home screen button. It has a display property, which isn't like CSS display property. It's something specific about apps, and your options are things, well, browser is an option, which means that it opens up in the web browser and just looks like a web page. But the other options are standalone to be like an app, or full screen be like a full screen app. And I think there's a couple other in-between options as well. And the other thing is icons, because you need an icon to be added to that home screen. Just as you know, with icons and web pages, every operating system and browser and platform wants their own icons things. That unfortunately hasn't changed. You're still going to have a zillion and one icons, and everybody wants them just the right size. But the benefit is, instead of having all those icons on every HTML page in the head, it would all be in one manifest file that only gets downloaded once. Of course, for the time being, in order to progressively enhance and support older browsers, you're going to have to do both, but ideally we'll get to all those icons are only listed once in the manifest file. Some other things. The screen is a little bigger than mine, and it was only 2 columns. But anyways, other options in the manifest, something called scope. So let me look at them. So these, you can see the tiny text at the top, are hosted on GitHub Pages. And GitHub Pages gives me a domain name, but then each repo is a folder. So if I want something that's specifically for this slide deck, it's not going to be for the entire domain. It's going to be for a subfolder. So the scope says which subfolder of your domain this manifest applies to. So again, if you're doing multilingual site, depending on how you've set up your URLs, if you've got example.com/n versus an example.com/fr, then that's easy to match up to manifest scopes. And scopes will come up with the Serviceworker parts that get to a bit. So gonna kind of skip over one of these other things. Basically, 2 parts of manifest data are things that will be used in an app store listings and things that will actually affect how things opening up, like orientation, always open in landscape. There's also options to say, yeah, here's the manifest for the website, but you should really download a native app instead. And so you probably don't need that bit in your manifest. When I was looking at the spec, there's also something about a service worker declaration in the manifest, but apparently that's not implemented anywhere yet. So maybe eventually there'll be service workers in manifest. So you put the manifest on your website. What effect will it actually have? This is fairly new, but support is becoming pretty good. Android browsers have had progressive web app support in the sense of being able to install a website like an app for a few years, starting in Chrome, but now all the Android browsers. Safari 11.1 came out last week. It has installable progressive web apps that use the manifest and service workers. Microsoft Edge 17, which is currently out in Preview Insider Edition and should be going to stable end of this month, early next, supports them. And so I expect very soon other browser combinations on Mac and iOS and on Windows will be able to do it the same. They're just waiting for the basic operating system support. So that's about all I could possibly tell you about manifests. Said it's just a JSON file, but you have to kind of look at what the browsers and operating systems want. The JavaScripty stuff comes when you're talking about service workers. So, what is a service worker besides the person who serves you beer and hamburgers? Well, when we're talking about JavaScript, the word worker is used to describe a script that runs in its own global scopes. We're just talking about scopes as in function scopes and nested scopes, but the outer scope is the global scope. And normally, all our scripts on a web page all run in the same scope, so they're all sharing access to variables, which means they all have to work on the same thread because they all need to keep coordinated who's accessing which variable when. Web workers provide a way, and there's also workers on Node, a way to define a separate script that runs its own code, has its own global scope, doesn't have access to the document, so you're not fighting over access to the document, and has kind of a restricted set of messaging back and forth between two scripts that can then run on separate threads, so run in parallel, and you can do complicated calculations without freezing up your interface. So generally, web workers, you can use them for all sorts of calculations, but the service worker in particular is a worker script that acts as a server, as a proxy server for all file fetches coming from the website. So if a website is associated with service worker, if it needs an image, whether it's coming from the markup request or whether it's coming from an XHR request in your code, it's going to make the fetch as normal, but the browser, instead of going and getting the file from the internet direct, the browser is going to first check in with your service worker script and saying, do you want to do anything special with this request? And so things that a service worker could do is it could say, oh, I can handle that without you going to the internet and give you this instead. Or I can let you fetch, but if you return an error, I'm going to do something instead. Or let you fetch, but then when it comes back, I'm going to change and modify it in some way. So all your, not all, but many of your ins and outs coming from the website are going through your service worker code. And the important thing that's really unique about service workers is it's not attached to a specific page. It's attached to as many tabs as you have open that are within that website domain and URL scope. Okay, and part of this is it has access to a cache of requests and responses, so it doesn't always need to go to the internet to find things, which is important because we started talking about this, service workers for offline support. The internet isn't always there, so if it has a cache, then the main page can just request files as normal and not having to worry about whether it's online or off. The service worker does all the worrying about what to do if you're offline. So how do you put a service worker? Well, in your main JavaScript code, you call this well, it's one line of code plus a support test. So new feature's been added to the navigator object, a service worker feature, and you just register with a path to the correct script. And the browser goes back off and downloads that service worker script and runs it, and then it starts getting complicated. So before I get to the complicated, why is it worth all the complications? What's the benefit? Your minimum viable service worker, as I've mentioned before, is just custom offline error pages. So think about how designers love creating 404 error pages, and the new thing is going to be your custom offline error page. And just little fun joke, sorry, you're offline, we can't get that article for you. And that's right now considered the bare minimum to count as a progressive web app, is that if somebody clicks and opens your website, it's going to at least show something other than the regular browser error page. More maximal service worker ideas, well, you could have games and other apps that don't really need the network. Once they've downloaded their stuff, they can just work on their own, and rather than having to have everything in a single file, you can still have your main interface act like it has access to a network, but the service worker is serving everything from a cache. For more conventional websites, you can add a save for offline feature where you like this article, click this button, and we'll save these articles for you to read when you're on a subway or airplane or wherever you don't have good Wi-Fi. And then they'll open it up, the app, and it'll generate, these are all your saved articles page. More complex stuff, things like actually manipulating files and changing the file in JavaScript. Like I was thinking you could resize images rather than, rather than download the big image and then also download the thumbnail. Just, okay, wait, we've already got the big image scaled. You're asking for the thumbnail. We can do that right here in the browser. Or dynamically generate code like your index of save for offline pages. And then the other thing is remembering that the service worker is not just attached to one particular tab, it's attached to many, so it can kind of help keep everything coordinated and talking to each other. I think you can do that with the regular web worker kind of communication, but service worker has sort of a single centralized control. But there are problems, or maybe not problems, but difficulties before you get too deep in and you start, oh my God, this is way too complicated. Why did I agree to create demo for a talk? So cache invalidation is a big issue. So cache invalidation, in other words, knowing when to trash your cache, when to throw out your saved files. It is often considered one of the hard problems of computer science. The other hard problem being naming things, and I already started with how that kind of was wacky with progressive web apps. So because the service worker is controlling the cache, that means you as the JavaScript coder are responsible for cache invalidation instead of letting the browser handle all it. You've got control. You can do all sorts of fancy things, but you can also mess it up in all sorts of interesting ways. So, basic problem, you're using cache versions of the files and using as much as possible, not using the internet, then how do you know when a file has been updated on the server? There are many possible ways you could approach this, but one thing that is built into the design of this feature is that the browser will regularly check to see if the service worker itself needs an update. So anytime the user loads a new page that has that registered service worker, it'll check and see if the service worker has updated, if it's online, or wait until the next time it is online, check and see if that service worker script has changed since the last time it's used. If it hasn't changed, it won't do anything at all. It'll keep the same service worker running. But if the script has changed, then the new script will be downloaded and it will be installed, which is a technical term in the service worker spec. So the idea is then, once you've got a new script, it can change the cache and it can get rid of anything that needs to be updated. So the key idea there, if you're working with service workers, is every time you update your website, you need to update the service worker file in a way that doesn't have to be a big change, but it has to be enough of a change that the server's going to say, this file has changed since you were last there. So you might want to include some sort of version number that you're just incrementing as a constant in the top of the file. And then somewhere in that code, you're going to have some way of keeping track of what needs to be thrown out after each update. So how you do that is going to totally depend on how you're using your service worker, but you'll need something in that service worker file that handles the updates. But here's where it gets complicated. There can only be one. Insert Highlander gift. Your service worker isn't attached to a particular browser window. It's for all tabs associated with the website. So how can you download a new service worker when you've got an old service worker and they have to battle it out and one has to come supreme? Except it's a little more organized than that because it is computer science. So why is this an issue? So Jake Archbold, Google DevRel, who's writing a lot about service workers, in the general case, if you're using, for example, the local storage API, which is shared across any tabs that are accessing a particular domain, you can have two different tabs that maybe were opened at different times with different code, and they start fighting over that local storage. So this can result in errors or worse, data loss. Users actively dislike data loss. It causes them great sadness. Jake's funny joke, not mine. But yeah, so the complexity of the service worker spec is all about trying to handle the shared cache with possibly many different tabs open at once. So what happens? The new service worker waits. It gets downloaded, it gets installed, but it doesn't get to do anything by default until all tabs that were using the old worker have closed. So it just sits there until nothing is using the old worker, and then the old worker can retire and the new worker can take over the job. That's the default. You do have an option. You can say a waiting server, so it gets downloaded, it runs an install event handler function, and you have the option at the end of that event handler function to say, skip waiting. Make me the service worker in charge. And so that's called activation. And there's another event handler that runs when you activate a service worker. All the service worker stuff happens through event handlers. There is no ongoing global scope. If the service worker isn't being used, it gets shut down. So everything service worker is done through event handlers. So by saying skip waiting, that service worker gets control of all new tabs or refreshes for your domain, but it doesn't suddenly take over the existing tabs that have an existing relationship with the old service worker. To do that, you have a separate method to say, okay, anything that is currently open that we have in our scope, we want control over everything coming from them. So again, it's confusing, but it's to avoid suddenly switching things up, because depending on what your main website is doing, maybe there's dynamic state that is messaging back and forth with the service worker, and you don't want to suddenly interrupt it just because somebody opened up a different tab. So you have all these methods to kind of control when to jump in, or you can just leave it if the updates aren't that important and you're just setting up the new service worker for next time. There's also ways in the main document code for them to find the service workers through that navigation navigator object, and send a message the other way saying, hey, if there's a new service worker, it can take over. So again, it's very open-ended depending on what you're actually doing and when's the chance that some things will get mixed up. I've got to do something about all these floating periods at the end of my highlighted text. So I'm certainly not the expert. I have spent a lot of time reading this week and trying to code up things, but if you want to learn more, some places that I found useful. If you're just looking for inspiration about what this is, there's a site called PWA Rocks that has just a gallery of various examples, and some of these are demos that people made, but some of them are large business sites. AliExpress is a big one. Flipkart is apparently like equivalent to Amazon in India, and it's one of the big success stories when they switched from native app to a web app, and huge, like doubling conversion rates because people didn't have to download that app to buy that one thing that they needed. So yeah, if you're trying to get an idea of what's possible and look at, open these websites and then turn off your Wi-Fi and see what their custom error pages are, or maybe you don't even notice that you're offline because they have so much functionality that goes with it. And if you're going beyond inspiration, places to read, MDN has a great new bunch of docs that just went up last week, sort of guides, and of course all the regular API docs. The Google Developers has a number of very useful tutorials. There's a site called the Serviceworker Cookbook that really breaks down, if you're trying to do this specific thing, here is this specific code, and really narrow down examples. And if that's not enough, you can go straight to the specs. There's a service worker spec and a web manifest spec. The editor's drafts are on w3c.github.io. The one thing I'd warn about those is those are the latest drafts, and so the latest thing in the draft might not be actually in all the browsers. Like that whole thing about you can just declare the service worker in your web manifest. And I asked a couple of the regular guys on Twitter, does this actually work? And like, no, sorry. Do it in the regular JavaScript method. Another important tool is Lighthouse, which isn't just progressive web apps specifically, but it's website analysis tool that Google's team came up with. It is now integrated in your Chrome dev tool, and I can so see if I can pump up. So first thing, DevTools has a description of the app manifest, including I've got an error when I was trying to fix something else. I messed things up. So summary of what was in the manifest that I created, but the audit is an extra feature. See if it'll be a bit faster if I get rid of the other one. And this is, right in your dev tools, and it sort of gives you helpful little performance tips as you're waiting, but it's looking at many different factors, but an important thing is it's looking at the factors that Chrome on Android will use in order to decide whether it'll eventually send a little pop-up notification to somebody who visits your site a lot saying, hey, by the way, you can install this as an app. You can save to your home screen, which is something that Chrome does, but it only does it if you meet certain qualifications for being a good appy website. There are similar standards where Microsoft has declared what their standards for being app, because not only are they going to let you install if you're using Microsoft Edge, but they're going to start listing these apps in the Windows Store, and you can install your web app without ever opening a web browser. So you will see there are lots of failures with my web app because it's not complete and it does not have a service worker, and so it does not have offline support. But well, I can look at the past audits, the ones that I did get in. So yes, I do at least have something there when JavaScript is not available, and actually I have a completely functional website when JavaScript is not available. I made a point of doing this in a good development progressive mode, starting with markup and then CSS and then JavaScript and working up. And fast page load, because these slides are plain text with like one word on each thing. And a couple other things that I initially had X's for, but they were easy to fit. So again, useful tool once you're getting to actually making an app for a client where you've promised your client that this will be installable just like an app. Make sure it checks off all these tools. Okay. Can we close that? And so I think that's my last slide. So yeah, Chrome's head out of the gate as far as dev tools for progressive web apps, but Firefox has also been adding Serviceworker and dev tools. The Safari that came out last week has apparently lots of dev tools. I'm sure the Edge that'll come out next month will have lots of dev tools. So it's really gaining steam. Developing is going to have a lot more resources to make it easier to develop, and it's a lot more worthwhile because you're not just putting all this work in for Android app Lite. You're actually getting the idea of build your app once and it works everywhere, especially if you do the proper progressive web development. And that's all I've got. So throw some questions at me. I will try to answer.
Just a quick thing, just time-wise, I think maybe just like one or two quick ones.
Yeah.
And at the end, we can use some of the discussion time, maybe if there are more questions. Yeah, we'll see how it goes. That is not to discourage any questions.
I've only looked into Lighthouse. I've never looked into Lighthouse. How much setup was that?
It's right in DevTools right now. It used to be an extension that you had to install, but it's right in DevTools. It's just, you've got tabs for your console and for your network, and there's one that's called Audits, and that's what I opened up was Audits, and it's just right there, press a click. It's already in Chrome.
Okay.
I've got one for you. Are we starting to see frameworks or anything for sort of the service worker scripts? Like obviously there's going to be similar functionality, some kind of offline caching, some kind of detection and checking for a new version and gracefully asking the old versions to hold. I'm just wondering how sophisticated that's coming yet.
I don't know. I don't think there are any service worker specific frameworks. There's stuff like that service worker cookbook where, okay, here's your boilerplate that you can copy and paste. What will be interesting is seeing how the big frameworks like React and all that start trying to build this in so that anything where you're doing sort of dynamically changing content, that you can tie that into a cache.
Amelia, I'll just add, I don't know when they added it, but the last couple of times I've used Create React app, it's added to Serviceworker by default. And it's actually been annoying. I've had to turn it off a couple of times while I was developing. But so they're definitely starting to have a bit more.
They've since removed it.
Oh, have they?
It's opt-in now instead of opt-out.
That's nice, because I always just turned it off when it was there.
Would it actually do anything, or was it just an empty file?
Cache your entire app and not let anything change.
Yeah, that is one thing that is going to best practices need to develop, because I've seen lots of things where it's as soon as you go to a website, it's let us cache everything on your browser. And it's like, no, that is no better than downloading an entire app, except it's worse because I don't have a choice. It happens automatically. So yeah, you want to have some sort of opt-in before you use up somebody's data plan. Christopher.
I just have a, I guess, two-part contrarian type question. I'm not familiar a whole lot with PWA beyond obviously doing a lot of this, similar type stuff over the years. If I just wanted speed, why wouldn't I just go with AMP? And if I was, most of my web applications always require to be, always on, like always connected, what would I gain by going a PWA route? If what I mean is I don't need the offline support.
If you don't need any offline support at all, the benefits are probably more limited, but it's ways that you can just reduce the network usage. I mean, it's a matter of thinking. You as a developer might think people always need to be online, people are always going to have good internet, but are they really? Is somebody going to be desperately trying to do something while they're traveling to a meeting and Wi-Fi connectivity is bad, or they're traveling around the world and roaming data is horrible? So a lot of this is coming with respect the user, respect their data plan, and make it more from their perspective. But it's always going to depend on exactly what your app is trying to do.
Exchange.js is Edmonton's JavaScript meetup. Thanks to our sponsors, Jobber and Investopedia. Support the meetup and like and share this video, and stay informed by following us on Twitter and meetup.com. Links in the description. See you soon!